It's Searching for Answers, and we're glad that you're searching right along with us here as we work our way through the Word of God, asking ourselves always, what did it mean when it was written, and what does it mean in our lives today? We're bringing those questions to bear on Paul's letter to Timothy, who is a young colleague, been assigned to a major city and to the pastoral work of that great congregation there. Lots of issues, lots of challenges. So get your Bible and find the first epistle to Timothy around the middle of the New Testament. And we'll jump right in here with Dr. Bernard Taylor, Old Testament specialist, research professor in religious studies here at Loma Linda University, and Dr. Leo Rancelin, New Testament scholar, Associate Dean of the School of Religion at Loma Linda University. My name is John Jones in the Divinity School at La Sierra, and we are glad you're with us. We're right into chapter 2. We see that verse 8 right down through verse 15 as basically one paragraph. So we may break it up into pieces a little as we go, but let's start with verse 8 and work our way down through it again. Dr. Bernard, take us into it and see where we go.
All right. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 8 and onwards. I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or argument. Also, that the women should dress themselves modestly and decently in suitable clothing, not with their hair braided or with gold, pearls, or expensive clothes, but with good works, as is proper for women who profess reverence for God. Let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. And through there, woman can also be translated as wife. And man can be translated as husband, and as we continue.
Yeah.
For Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing, provided they continue in faith and love and holiness with modesty.
How do you feel about that, friends? We looked a little bit at this at the close of our last conversation, but there's more to work on, isn't there? So stay with us, and we'll begin to pick up the pieces a little bit. Anything you want to...
One of the things, well, first off, 1 Timothy has a companion, 2 Timothy, and then Titus, and these are often known as the pastoral epistles. These are pastoral in tone. They're not primarily theology, though that is not irrelevant. And we have answers, we don't have questions. And so, for instance, I desire that men should pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or argument. Why would he say that? Unless perhaps there is tension and anger that has arisen in the past. And don't let prayer become a vehicle for this unholy practice. And the women should dress themselves modestly and decently in suitable clothing, on the one hand, not with their hair braided or with gold and pearls, expensive clothes, on the other hand, but with good works, as is proper for women who profess reverence for God. So here we have a situation where there are those, obviously it must be being done. And when we think about who would do it, you have on the one hand those who have come from wealth and are accustomed to dressing in this fashion.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, those who have no access to it and would never be able to do it, and in the process are being shown up, so that going to church is an embarrassing situation because you always come up short. So, there's a start.
That's a good start. Leo, what do you think?
So I think, as I said at the previous session that it's important that we apply appropriate interpretive guidelines to this text. And for me, here's how I think we need to begin. First of all, and this passage needs to be interpreted within the larger context of the New Testament, within the larger context of the 13 letters of Paul. And when I look at those 13 letters, I see that in Romans 16, women played an influential role in Paul's apostolic team. When I look at Philippi, I see that in Philippians, Paul alludes to 2 women that were leaders of that Philippian church. When I look at Corinth, especially 1 Corinthians 11, it's a tough text, but what comes through clearly is that women prayed, and prophesied during the worship service. And I think when you prophesy, there's an element of instruction and teaching that takes place within the community of believers.
In fact, that's what prophesy really means. It's not merely foretelling the future. It's actually speaking forth-telling on behalf of God to the people, isn't it?
So when you look at those larger texts, you see that women played a leading role in churches,
yes,
and they taught in churches. And so when you come to this text, please be aware of those realities, and you can't, as I said previously, universalize this text to say this is for all time, that Paul wants to restrict the role of women in the life of the church. The other piece that I think is important to add is that Ephesus had the cult of Artemis. And at the cult of Artemis, women played a very, very influential role in that cult, in that religion. And it's quite possible that women converted out of Artemis and may well now have come into the church at Ephesus and wanting to exercise perhaps that same kind of influential role at Ephesus. And the church was, I think, being destabilized potentially by that kind of a sentiment and experience that they had previously. And then the other aspect that I think we need to consider is that without question, there is some false teaching taking place here with some false teachers. And it's possible that some of these perhaps wealthier women had fallen prey to the influence of these false teachers and were exercising inordinate amount of authority and influence within the church. And I think for Paul, when you have, I think, both men or women destabilizing the church, he gets a bit huffy about it. And it's problematic for him. Yeah. Because for him, order and stability and harmony in the church is crucial. As a matter of fact, right at the end of 1 Corinthians 14, after he deals with the issue of speaking in tongues and prophecies, he does say right at the end, all things should be done decently and in order.
Yes.
Crucial for Paul. And so this is not taking place during the worship service. And in light of all that, I think he has some draconian measures that he takes here to bring about order, decency, stability, and harmony.
Yes.
That's how I read this text. Specific problem at Ephesus. Please do not universalize this for all time.
Yeah, exactly so. Indeed, these verses, 8 through 15, flow right out of his burden in the first half of chapter 2 for public respect, decency, dignity, honorable conduct and behavior. This is now simply bringing it home to the particular lifestyle of the Christians as Christians. Right. And so I think it's of a piece with the larger overarching principles he's laid down in the first half of chapter 2. But it's clear that he has a particular kind of mission, a kind of vision in mind, right? For what a Christian ought to look like and sound like and behave like, men and women.
Yeah. And what he does say is clothed with the culture of his time.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah.
And we must not forget that either. He's a creature of his time.
Yeah, it is. It's a sharply divided world in which generally men and women had very little to do with each other, particularly in public. But there was, behind the scenes, a certain amount of immorality, oftentimes cloaked in the robes of religious experience, interestingly enough. So there's already a framework of superstition, of suspicion, I should say, rather. People wondering about these different funny cults and sects that are Roman writers complained that in this time of the Roman Empire that all kinds of strange religions are popping up around the Mediterranean world, and they don't like it. And Christianity is very susceptible to just looking like one more of these strange kind of things. And Paul really wants to make the case, no, that's not us. It is interesting that men should pray lifting up holy hand, not against each other, which is probably part of the turn of phrase here.
Right.
When you visit the catacombs underneath the city of Rome, there are small chapels carved out in the soft limestone there that were places of worship for not only Christians but other groups as well. But certain ones are identified as Christian. You can see that by the markings on the plaster wall. And these frescoes, these paintings that are on the wall, the colors worked into the fresh plaster while it's still damp, are scenes of early Christian worship from the 1st and early 2nd century. You can see how they prayed. Men are portrayed standing with their hands up, praying to God in this position. We think they got that out of Judaism. We think that that was a practice in the synagogues at that time as well. But it's clear that Paul wants to sanctify the Christian experience. Say, if you raise your hands, let it not be against each other, but toward God in submission and supplication. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why did the Christian church have such a difficult time with heterodoxy, with false teaching? On the one hand, they must have seen a value in it because, you don't have counterfeit brown paper.
Right.
It's not worth anything.
Right.
The desire to cheaply gain access to something is an indication that it's a thing of value that they can monetize or something like that. And but there is this battle, this struggle for it to survive.
Yeah.
The Didache, which means teaching, the early Christian document, was struggling with this same sort of world too. It's fascinating.
It is. It's much more richly textured than most of us realize. There's such a tendency, to say, well, back in the early church, as if that were a one unitary thing. The fact of the matter is that scholars increasingly say we cannot speak of the early Christian church, only of the early Christian churches. There is so much difference among them, even within the 1st century, when our New Testament was being written. We can find traces of very different understandings of God, quite diverse understandings of Jesus, who he was and what he accomplished, and of what the Christian life should look like. Indeed, we have that very issue at work here in Paul's letter to Timothy, because there apparently was one current of early Christianity that maybe Timothy is a little attracted to, of a sort of a spiritual life that's made up of asceticism, severe practices, putting down the body. We'll get to that in more detail in a later conversation. But here is one stream of among several within early Christianity. So you're right. There were currents that were pushing and pulling, and which later on actually split out in different directions. And then you have, finally, the attempt in the early churches to define heresy. It's not quite heresy in the New Testament, but it's the precursors of some heretical movements that had to be trimmed back a couple hundred years down the road here. What do you think?
I think you're absolutely right. And as I've read through these 6 chapters trying to ascertain the nature of the false teaching, you just get bits and pieces here, myths and endless genealogies. They forbid marriage and abstinence of certain foods. They're wrapped up with profane myths and old wives' tales. And then at the end of chapter 6, I think it's an important verse there, He says, verse 20, avoid profane chatter and contradictions of what is falsely called gnosis, knowledge.
Yeah.
So maybe incipient Gnosticism, perhaps percolating in this church, an esoteric religious group that's got this strange understanding of things, as you said, asceticism perhaps. And it looks like Paul calls out two people, Hymenaeus and Alexander. It looks like they've been excommunicated from the church.
Yeah.
And maybe there's still some within.
Yeah.
As I read through the 6 chapters, I gain a sense, wow, Paul's really, I think, concerned about this influence and this group of people within the church.
Yes.
And that's why he says, hey, I urge you to tell these people not to teach different doctrine.
Yeah.
Right at the beginning.
Yeah, right. Chapter 1, verse 3.
Yep.
You don't get funny with the doctrines.
Yep.
Yeah? And don't be so preoccupied, verse 4, with these genealogies and this and that. Frankly, we don't know what that was all about.
Right.
We're not sure. There are hints that it may even have hooked into some ideas of humans and angels somehow, procreating or whatever. We just don't know. But apparently, it was enough to be a real distraction and to lead some people astray. Yeah.
And so when you piece all that together, is it possible that in chapter 2, these women who are being are causing some difficulty have been co-opted by these false teachers?
Well, yeah, we read the warning against what he calls old wives' tales, so to speak. So, yeah, I think all of this, Leo, underscores your point. This may be a particular situation in Ephesus.
I think it is.
Where the female side of the congregation needs some particular encouragement and reproof, frankly. But even to generalize that, across the early church, within the first century, is already a problem, much greater to pull it out and try to generalize it for our lives today.
Yeah.
We need that warning, and I think it's important. Then how are we to say, let a wife learn in silence with full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority. Keep silence. And yet, Leo, you have already alerted us to that strange surprise we encounter in Romans chapter 16, where Paul is saying hello to everybody in Rome and sends his greetings there in verse 7. Hello to Andronicus and Junia, perhaps husband and wife.
Yep.
They're his relatives. They belong to his extended family in some way. And Andronicus, a Latin name, is male, masculine ending. Junia is a feminine ending.
Yep.
The early copyists of these ancient manuscripts were so scandalized by the idea that Junia could be numbered among the apostles, as she is in verse 7, among the apostles. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
That they changed the ending. This cannot be Junia. This has got to be Junius. It's got to be a man. And they changed the text. Those scribes in those monasteries, in those European monasteries, just couldn't believe it. And they changed it to a masculine ending because these are apostles. A woman cannot possibly be an apostle. But here's Paul saying, say hi to Junia.
Yep.
She's among the apostles, a leading church leader. When we read this about keeping silent, we have to acknowledge the larger canonical context, as you've reminded us.
Go down the road a little further for the audience and explain how you know that it was changed.
Simply, the earliest manuscripts all have the feminine ending. The later manuscripts have the masculine. And in the process of going from copy to copy to copy, it got caught on and everyone followed it.
Yep.
Yeah. I think that will be helpful for them.
Yeah.
It's just too much for us to think of a woman as an apostle.
Yes. Yes. So here we are. Now, the thing about Adam and Eve, then, Adam formed first and then Eve. We think the rabbis used to make a point out of that as well. But what are we to make of this? I mean, what's the line of argument here in 1 Timothy 2? What shall we say?
This moral exhortation, let's also confess, this is a difficult text.
Yeah.
Because this moral exhortation that he does give is grounded theologically in this creation account, right? As you know, verses 13 and 14.
Now, for the rabbis, the original situation always took precedence. You go back to the beginning, and that trumps everything else.
Yes, that's right.
And here is a trip back to the beginning, and there is an order. Adam first, and then Eve. But then it says that Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived. And by our standards, if you are deceived, then you're off the hook. At least, you are not as culpable as somebody who goes in with both eyes open and does it anyway. Yeah. Even if we are to suggest that it was out of love for Eve and fear that she would be without a husband that he did it.
Or that he would be without a wife.
And that too, yes.
Yeah. Even so, now, we don't know. The Greek allows for several different nuances in verse 15 about the relationship between being saved and giving birth. It can mean, in a way, despite, I'm probably overstating it a bit, but even though she is giving childbirth, she will be saved, or that childbirth is a pathway toward her salvation. Yeah. We're not quite sure of the Greek syntax there and how best to render that over into our English today. But nonetheless, the main point stands. It's a matter of faith and love and holiness, with modesty, right? Yeah, sophrasunes, humility or modesty. What do you think?
For me, I think another point that is important to underscore with respect to Paul, oftentimes when Paul faces challenges in his church, he gets exercised about. And you could say almost goes over the top. Let me give you, for example, there at the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 4, as he's trying to address, lay the groundwork from some specific issues from chapter 5 and following, he does say, what would you have me come here, with a stick or with a spirit of love or gentleness? That's a bit over the top. Yes. And then in Galatians, he says, I wish they would go the whole way and take the knife. And then in 1 Corinthians 10 through 13, he's got to deal with the issue of super apostles there at Corinth. And he is almost beside himself as he addresses that challenge that he has there at Corinth. And so I think when he really goes after a problem, he goes with full vigor. And maybe here with the issue of worship being compromised, he grounds that theologically with this text here of Adam and Eve. So I think that's kind of how I read that, and childbearing. For me, it's a bit over the top, Paul, but I take your point. We need to have order and stability and harmony within worship services.
I will agree with you, at least to a certain extent. We do not have Paul, I think, here sort of sitting back with his cup of tea, and today we would say with his pipe. No, we wouldn't. But, with his manuscripts and kind of working it through and crossing out and thinking it through, I don't think so. We know that Paul, maybe not always, but regularly, had somebody taking dictation, writing as fast as possible. Right. Indeed, at Romans, Paul is saying hello to everyone, and the Tertius, his scribes, scribbles in quickly. Oh, between name, I Tertius send you my greetings also. Right. We see Paul the rhetorician. We see Paul the shepherd. He's a pastor for sure. But we see Paul even in a letter to Timothy, who is a Paul who speaks in public. He's a rhetorician. He speaks in public.
Right.
And we see him pacing back and forth, shaking his fist, in the air, kind of laying it on them. And he is exercised about some problems there in Ephesus, and for good reason.
Yes.
They've got problems. Paul is deeply concerned about that.
Yes.
So here he has to tackle, starting with chapter 3 and following, he will have some specific advice to Timothy. But right here, he's got advice to the whole congregation. And he's really preaching at them rather than Timothy.
Yeah.
And Timothy, here's what I want you to tell them. In a way, he's speaking through Timothy.
Another example of that in 1 Corinthians 1, Paul says, look, I didn't baptize anybody except Crispus and Gaius. And then he says, oh, wait a minute, perhaps another person.
Yeah.
So sometimes he's quite engaged in the matter at hand.
There's an orality, a verbal quality to these texts that he's... And someone's trying to get it down as fast as they can. Yeah.
I'm still back with Adam and Eve
Yes.
and the childbearing. And it occurs to me that this is actually accounting for, which is a substitute for exegeting, the story back then. Eve was deceived, Adam wasn't, and in the next chapter, Eve, it says that in sorrow she will bring forth. And I think that the text is understanding that she was forgiven and she was given a task. It's not that every woman has to bear children to be saved. That has nothing to do with it. And I do this, I hope, faithfully following your call for study of the context and the background and where it came from. And so that's, I think, what I see as at play here.
You know, later on, we're going to bump into a stream or current within this congregation who were opposed to marriage. And it may be that right here, we have an acceptance of marriage and of childbirth, which is part of the appropriate way. It at the same time entails love and holiness and modesty. So these are positives, but it may already be a foreshadowing of what Paul is about to say soon on the larger issues of sexuality in one's life as well. These are richly embroidered passages. The thoughts flow quickly upon one another as Paul writes. They complicate the picture through associations that don't necessarily suggest themselves to us. But I think they were part of the standard way of thinking in those days, which we need to take in consideration as we continue searching for answers.